The moment someone feels they're losing you, their behavior can change overnight. And what comes next is rarely logical, calm, or predictable. What looks like confidence, drama, or sudden intensity is usually something else entirely. And once you understand it, you'll never misread these situations again. If this is making sense so far, pause for a second, hit like, and stay with me because understanding this dynamic puts you permanently ahead of the emotional curve. When emotional security feels threatened, behavior shifts from comfort seeking to control seeking, and this happens almost entirely outside conscious awareness. At the beginning of any emotional bond, security allows the nervous system to relax, which is why people act natural, patient, and grounded. But the moment that security feels unstable, less attention, emotional distance, unpredictability, or a perceived withdrawal, the brain does not interpret it as a relationship issue, it interprets it as a survival issue. Attachment is wired into the same neurological systems that govern safety. When safety feels compromised, the brain stops prioritizing harmony and starts prioritizing certainty. Comfort-seeking behaviors like calm communication, patience, and empathy give way to control-seeking behaviors like testing, provoking reactions, intensifying emotions, or creating situations that force engagement. This is not manipulation in the cinematic sense, it is emotional self-regulation under stress. The mind is trying to close an open loop. Uncertainty creates anxiety, and anxiety demands resolution. Control is the fastest shortcut the brain knows to reduce that anxiety. This is why actions suddenly feel dramatic or out of character. The person isn't trying to be dramatic, they are trying to feel grounded again. Control seeking can show up as increased affection, sudden vulnerability, jealousy, emotional confrontations, or even strategic silence. Each of these behaviors serves the same purpose: to measure influence. If a reaction is triggered, the brain registers, I still matter, I still have impact. If there is no reaction, the anxiety escalates, and so does the behavior. Importantly, this shift is not a sign of strength or confidence. It is a signal of internal instability. People who feel secure do not need to control outcomes, they trust them. People who feel insecure attempt to manage emotions externally because they can't regulate them internally. That's why reassurance, even when given, often doesn't work for long. The issue isn't logic or communication, it's nervous system regulation. Until the sense of emotional safety is restored or the loss is fully accepted, the behavior will continue to oscillate between closeness and conflict, intensity and withdrawal, because the brain is searching for equilibrium and will use any behavior that promises relief, even temporarily. The fear of loss activates primal survival instincts rather than rational thought, and this is why behavior under emotional threat often feels confusing or exaggerated. When the possibility of losing someone becomes real, the brain doesn't consult logic, values, or long-term consequences first. It goes straight to older neurological systems designed to prevent abandonment, exclusion, or separation because historically those meant danger. In that state, the mind is not asking, what is the healthiest response? It is asking, how do I stop this from happening right now? That shift changes everything. Reason slows down, emotional memory speeds up, and past attachment wounds quietly take control of present behavior. Even highly intelligent, self-aware people can act in ways that surprise themselves because the response is driven by instinct, not intention. This is why explanations given afterward often sound inconsistent or incomplete. The behavior made sense in the moment because it served an emotional survival function, not a logical one. Loss fear compresses time. The future disappears and everything becomes about immediate relief. This is why people may say or do things they would normally avoid, escalate conflicts that don't need escalation, or cling to intensity as proof of connection. The nervous system is seeking reassurance, not truth. It wants signals of safety, attention, and relevance, and it will prioritize those signals over dignity, patience, or emotional restraint. This is also why communication tends to degrade under fear. Instead of clarity, there is urgency. Instead of listening, there is scanning for signs of rejection. Every pause, tone change, or delay gets magnified and interpreted as confirmation of loss. The mind becomes hyper-focused, not insightful. What makes this especially powerful is that primal fear doesn't feel like fear to the person experiencing it. It feels like justification. The emotions feel reasonable, even necessary. The reaction feels provoked, even when the trigger is subtle or imagined. That's why reassurance often fails. Reassurance speaks to logic, while fear lives in the body. Until the nervous system settles, no amount of explanation fully lands. The behavior continues not because the person wants conflict, but because their internal alarm hasn't turned off. Understanding this reveals that unexpected actions during perceived loss are not deliberate attempts to destabilize the bond, but automatic responses from a system trying to protect itself from emotional disappearance. People don't escalate because they feel confident. They escalate because they feel power slipping away. And that distinction explains almost every sudden emotional surge. Confidence is quiet, slow, and grounded. It doesn't rush, force, or demand proof. When someone feels secure in their emotional position, they allow space, ambiguity, and even temporary distance without panic. Escalation only happens when that inner stability cracks. The moment a person senses that their influence is weakening, less responsiveness, reduced emotional availability, or a shift in dynamics, the mind interprets it as a loss of leverage. And humans are deeply sensitive to leverage and attachment. Power here doesn't mean dominance, it means impact, the ability to affect the other person emotionally. When that impact feels threatened, behavior intensifies as an unconscious attempt to restore it. This is why escalation often looks disproportionate to the situation. The external trigger might be small, but the internal meaning is large. The brain isn't responding to what happened, it's responding to what might be happening. Loss of power feels like loss of relevance, and loss of relevance feels like emotional erasure. To prevent that, the nervous system pushes for action. Louder emotions, sharper words, sudden closeness, or dramatic gestures are all ways of testing whether influence still exists. If a reaction is produced, any reaction, the brain reads that as evidence of retained power. Silence or neutrality, on the other hand, feels threatening because it offers no feedback. No feedback means no confirmation of impact. This dynamic also explains why escalation often cycles. If the intensified behavior works temporarily, it reinforces the strategy. If it fails, the anxiety deepens and the escalation increases. What looks like volatility from the outside is actually a system trying to recalibrate its sense of control. Importantly, this isn't a conscious decision to manipulate. It's an instinctive attempt to stabilize an internal imbalance. The person may even believe they're simply being honest, passionate, or expressive because the emotional urgency feels authentic. But authenticity doesn't equal accuracy. The behavior is driven by fear of losing influence, not by clarity about the situation itself. Once you recognize that escalation is a signal of perceived power loss rather than confidence, the behavior stops looking mysterious and starts looking predictable. Sudden behavioral changes are usually signals rather than strategies, and they reveal internal panic more than intentional planning. When someone abruptly shifts how they speak, act, or engage, the assumption is often that they are making a calculated move to influence the situation. In reality, most people are not that deliberate under emotional stress. Panic collapses planning. It shortens perspective and pushes behavior to the surface before it's fully processed. What leaks out in those moments is not a long-term tactic, but an emotional reflex. The behavior is communicating something the person cannot articulate clearly: fear, insecurity, urgency, or loss of emotional footing. These shifts are the nervous system speaking louder than the rational mind. When internal stability is disrupted, consistency becomes difficult. That's why behavior can swing from warmth to distance, from vulnerability to defensiveness, from calm to intensity without warning. Each shift is an attempt to regulate an internal state, not to execute a coherent plan. The person is experimenting in real time, often unconsciously, searching for whatever reduces discomfort fastest. If closeness reduces anxiety, closeness appears. If withdrawal feels safer, withdrawal follows. The inconsistency itself is the signal. It shows that the person no longer feels anchored. Stability creates predictable behavior. Instability creates emotional noise. What's important to understand is that these behavioral leaks are honest, even when they're confusing. They reveal where the emotional pressure is highest. People under panic reveal priorities they might otherwise hide. Attention-seeking behaviors reveal fear of invisibility. Provocations reveal fear of indifference. Over-explaining reveals fear of being misunderstood or replaced. Even silence can be a signal, not of indifference, but of overwhelm or emotional shutdown. The behavior may look intentional, but the emotion driving it is reactive. Because these actions are signals, responding to them as if they were calculated strategies often escalates the situation. Treating panic like manipulation creates resistance instead of regulation. The behavior isn't asking to be outplayed, it's asking to be interpreted correctly. This doesn't mean accommodating or fixing it, but it does mean recognizing that the behavior is information. It tells you where emotional control has been lost. People who feel centered do not leak like this. They move slowly, communicate clearly, and remain consistent. When behavior becomes erratic, it's a sign that the internal system is under strain and searching for relief. And until that strain resolves, the signals will keep surfacing in different forms. Attention, validation, and reassurance become emotional currency when stability feels uncertain because the brain treats emotional connection like a survival resource rather than a luxury. When someone senses distance, inconsistency, or the potential loss of attachment, the nervous system immediately shifts priorities from calm engagement to securing confirmation of significance. In this state, every interaction is measured not by content or logic, but by whether it affirms relevance and presence. Smiles, words, eye contact, time spent, and even minor gestures transform into signals of safety, and their absence triggers anxiety. The emotional brain doesn't distinguish between small lapses and major threats. Any perceived reduction in attention is treated as a potential sign of abandonment. That's why previously steady individuals may suddenly seek excessive reassurance, ask repeated questions, or amplify behaviors to provoke acknowledgement. Each action is a way of checking the account balance of attention, making sure they are still valued and still matter. Reassurance is treated like currency because it provides immediate, measurable feedback to the internal system. When the emotional bank is low, instinct drives behaviors that refill it quickly, often bypassing conscious reasoning. This explains why sudden intensity, dramatic gestures, or even conflicts can appear. They're attempts to elicit acknowledgement and secure a sense of emotional credit. Silence, neglect, or even neutral behavior can feel like a deficit, causing the internal system to overcompensate through visible, sometimes unpredictable actions. Emotional security is not just a feeling, it is interpreted neurologically as stability and survival. When stability falters, the instinctive response is to seek the most direct route back to equilibrium, which is through attention and validation. What's critical to understand is that these behaviors are not manipulative by default. They are functional. They are attempts to regulate an internal state that has become unstable. The person may appear intense, reactive, or even irrational, but each behavior is directly linked to the perceived threat of losing connection. Recognizing this allows one to interpret sudden demands for attention not as attacks or tests, but as signals of emotional insecurity. By understanding that reassurance and validation function as currency under perceived threat, it becomes clear why certain behaviors escalate, repeat, or intensify until a sense of stability is restored, and why the unexpected often emerges when emotional security feels most fragile. Tests, provocations, or dramatic gestures are often attempts to measure emotional leverage, because when someone senses instability in a connection, the unconscious goal becomes assessing influence rather than simply expressing emotion. These behaviors are rarely random. They are experiments conducted by the nervous system to determine if the bond is still intact, if their presence still matters, and if they can still shape outcomes. The brain is essentially asking, do I still have effect here? And it does so through actions that force responses. This is why someone might suddenly escalate a conversation, push boundaries, provoke reactions, or introduce tension seemingly out of nowhere. The behavior isn't about winning an argument or creating chaos. It's about gathering data on relational impact. Each provocation is a measurement. Each test is feedback. The nervous system thrives on measurable responses, and when emotional leverage feels threatened, even subtle cues like delayed replies, neutral tone, or physical distance can trigger intensified testing. These actions often appear unpredictable because they are adaptive rather than premeditated. The goal isn't strategy in the traditional sense, it is immediate assessment and restoration of emotional equilibrium. A dramatic gesture, whether overly affectionate, unexpectedly vulnerable, or confrontational, provides rapid feedback. A positive response confirms continued influence, while indifference signals loss of control, prompting escalation or a different behavioral test. Importantly, this testing mechanism is unconscious. People rarely articulate it clearly because it operates below rational thought. From the outside, it can feel manipulative or confusing, but from an internal perspective, it is survival-oriented, a way to gauge attachment security. Understanding tests and provocations as attempts to measure leverage reframes them from being attacks or manipulative maneuvers into information about internal perception. The more intense or unexpected the behavior, the higher the perceived threat to influence. By recognizing that these gestures are signals rather than calculated strategies, it becomes possible to respond with awareness instead of reaction. The person is not trying to destabilize the relationship for fun. They are trying to regain a sense of certainty, and every test or dramatic act is a reflection of the emotional anxiety that arises when control or the perception of influence is slipping away. Silence or distance is frequently interpreted as abandonment, even when it isn't, because the mind doesn't process absence neutrally when emotional attachment is at stake. It interprets it as a threat. Humans are wired to detect separation cues. Even brief lapses in attention or responsiveness can trigger an internal alarm system. What feels like calm, reflective space to one person can feel like withdrawal, rejection, or erasure to another. This is especially true when emotional security has already been shaken. The nervous system does not distinguish between intentional absence and accidental lack of attention. The meaning is assigned automatically. If the connection isn't obvious and present, it is at risk. This is why someone may suddenly act out, escalate, or overcompensate in response to perceived distance. The behavior is not necessarily proportional to reality. It is proportional to perceived risk, and perception is driven by the brain's threat detection circuits. Silence becomes a canvas onto which fear projects possibilities. Every pause, delayed response, or neutral gesture is interpreted as a signal of decline in value, attention, or presence. The emotional system treats uncertainty like a fire alarm. It overreacts because underreacting carries the evolutionary cost of potential loss. This is why previously steady individuals may suddenly seek extreme reassurance, initiate intense conversations, or even provoke conflict. They are attempting to replace ambiguity with measurable engagement. Distance, whether physical, emotional, or conversational, challenges the internal sense of influence, and the instinctive reaction is to restore that influence immediately. Importantly, this does not imply calculation. The interpretation of silence as abandonment happens unconsciously, without strategic planning. It is an automatic emotional response shaped by attachment and survival wiring. The person may feel compelled to act in ways that are dramatic, uncharacteristic, or unpredictable simply because their internal system perceives that the bond is slipping. Recognizing this mechanism reframes seemingly erratic behavior from being a personal attack or manipulation into a signal of perceived instability. Understanding that distance or silence triggers fear responses allows one to interpret these reactions with clarity. The unexpected moves are not evidence of strategy or deceit. They are reflexive attempts to regain certainty, secure attention, and restore the emotional equilibrium that feels momentarily threatened. The most unexpected actions are rarely about love. They are about regaining certainty and control, because when emotional security feels threatened, behavior is driven less by affection and more by the brain's need to stabilize itself. The nervous system treats uncertainty as a danger signal, and in response, it prioritizes actions that produce immediate feedback over those that reflect long-term reasoning or consistency. What appears as sudden affection, dramatic gestures, or unpredictable behavior is often an unconscious attempt to test boundaries, gauge influence, and confirm that connection still exists. These actions are not deliberate manipulations in the conventional sense. They are instinctive attempts to reduce anxiety, reassert presence, and reclaim a sense of leverage. When someone feels the bond slipping, the body doesn't ask whether a response is rational, safe, or appropriate. It asks only, how do I feel secure again? This is why the unexpected can feel extreme or even contradictory. Intense displays of emotion, provocative statements, or sudden shifts in engagement are not necessarily reflective of the person's true intentions or overall feelings. They are signals that the internal system is operating under stress and searching for certainty. Even behaviors that seem confusing, contradictory, or counterproductive make sense when viewed through the lens of emotional survival. Every action is a test, a bid for reassurance, or a probe to see if influence remains. The person may appear irrational or unpredictable, but the pattern is consistent. All unexpected behaviors are about reducing perceived risk of loss and regaining a sense of control over the situation. Importantly, these behaviors are temporary and fluctuate with the level of perceived security. As soon as reassurance, attention, or stability is detected, even subtly, the intensity often diminishes. Conversely, continued uncertainty amplifies the actions, creating a cycle of unpredictable behavior until emotional equilibrium is restored. Recognizing that the most unexpected actions are rarely about love reframes them as signals of insecurity and need for certainty, rather than signs of caprice or malice. This awareness allows one to respond calmly, avoid overreacting, and interpret the behavior as information about internal perception rather than a reflection of the relationship's ultimate value, giving clarity and control in situations that otherwise feel chaotic and confusing.